Well, here we are. Dr. John Lott, thanks for taking the time to come and talk to me on Based, the podcast, and the subject of gun control and whatever else. And your work in that road certainly makes you based, which we always say before we have a guest on, because they usually are. So thanks for taking the time all the way from Salt Lake City in the United States. And you've just been in Australia a week or two ago doing a bit of a tour. And that's how I crossed paths with you. And I thought, well, this is the topic of firearms and firearm control and, the Second Amendment in the United States, with the sort of concepts that you talk about daily just don't get discussed here. So I thought it was a good chance to get you on and just thrash through some of the facts. There's a lot of facts that I think Australians are not across, and a lot of data that I think that we spoke about that I think people will be very interested in. But just as a starting point, I think it'd be interesting for people to understand a bit of your background. You're an economist and a political commentator. You're an author, and you've obviously got a particular interest in the subject of gun control or gun rights, those sorts of things, whatever we call it now. But can you tell me a little bit about your background and how you came to touring the very gun unfriendly surrounds of the continent of Australia to try and talk about this issue?
Right. Yeah, I've been an academic most of my life. I've had research or teaching positions at Stanford, University of Chicago, the Wharton Business School, Yale, UCLA, Rice. I've had positions in the federal government. I was chief economist for the United States Sentencing Commission in Washington. And more recently, I was the senior advisor for research and statistics in the U.S. Department of Justice. So I've been, crime really is my focus, not particular, whether it's policing or whether it's gun control or whatever, but crime is the bottom line. And I don't make Second Amendment arguments. It's not what interests me. I didn't get involved with this because of, rights issues. To me, the bottom line is just trying to figure out what makes people safer or not. And, being in Australia, the second time I've been there actually was in Australia in 96. I was actually offered the head of the economics department at ANU. Almost took it. It was a very tough decision. But to me, the interesting thing is how uninformed Australians are even about their own country. When I go and I talk to Australians, they seem to think Australia has a low violent crime rate. In fact, for decades, you guys have had a very high violent crime rate. The problem is that there are two measures that you have of crime. You have crimes reported to police, and then you have a total crime, both reported and unreported. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics goes and tries to measure total crime with the annual survey that it does. And, you take something like rapes and sexual assaults. In the United States, our Bureau of Justice Statistics estimates that about 45% of the time victims report those crimes to the police. In Australia, your Australian Bureau of Statistics estimates that it's 19% of the time that victims of rapes and sexual assaults report those to the police. So what you can see, if you have that huge difference in the rate that crimes are reported to the police, you may not want to go and look at just crimes reported to police as your measure there. And to be honest, I think the Australian Bureau of Statistics estimate has some problems with it, even with the 19%, because if you take the number of crimes that are actually reported to police, rapes and sexual assaults, and divide it by the ABS estimate of total rapes and assaults, it's only like 9% that are reported to the police. And so, that's just an amazingly low number that you have there. And so why did I go to Australia? Well, there were some academics that I know down there. A guy named Creston Green, who's at the University of Adelaide in the business school. He had suggested that I come down, and he reached out to an academic at University of New South Wales, G.G. Foster, who's, I guess, been well known for some of her discussions about COVID and what have you. And They basically did, particularly Gigi, did a lot of groundwork to kind of set it up and get me invited to give academic talk at ANU, and they tried to get one at Adelaide there, and I gave a number of other talks to different groups of people while I was there.
And so, and the premise, as you say, is about the concept of crime. Really, I mean, it's and I think that is pretty staggering for Australians to understand. I mean, if so I think, speaking from a sort of layperson's perspective here, the view of the United States is that it is a much more dangerous place for the average citizen. That's not the case,
Right.
according to your data, and yet we have this sort of, I guess, very different way of approaching self-defense. And really the issue of guns generally, I'm always taken by how it is that the Australian version and the United States version and views on firearms in particular is so different. They are so radioactive in Australia, and yet we come from largely the same stock, the kind of British heritage, just
Right.
evolved out of different I guess, manifestations. I mean, the United States was born out of the Revolutionary War. Do you see the views that we now have in this country, where we have some of the strictest controls on guns, as somehow related to that? That somehow the fact that we were brought here in the First Fleet as kind of a penal colony, and the United States was born out of fighting for its freedom. Does that, I mean, your mind, does that have some, play into where we're up to with the firearms control in this country?
My guess is it's probably more recent things are important in that respect. So I'll mention a few differences. One is just your political system. I mean, you have a parliamentary system that's there. We have a system of checks and balances, which makes it much more difficult to go and pass things quickly. We have a House and a Senate. I mean, I guess you guys have a Senate too, but um, our Senate has a filibuster rule that basically you have to have 60% of the votes in order to go and get anything passed. Uh, and neither party has that. So that requires compromising there. And then you have a president who may be of a different party than either this House or the Senate and may have different views on things and represent different constituents. And so the United States system was set up particularly to make it difficult to pass things quickly. And so in Australia, you have the Tasmania shooting, Port Arthur, and you passed legislation very quickly. Kind of why the iron was hot there. In the United States, you do have some states which may be completely controlled by Democrats that will pass legislation very quickly there. But federally, it's much more difficult. If we had the same type of system that you had in Australia, I suspect we would have passed things a number of times in the past that would have been more similar. I mean, you had politicians like Obama and Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden who have held up Australians' gun control laws as kind of the model that the United States should go and follow. So, I mean, if they had had their way, if they hadn't had to go and get things through a House and Senate here, they would have pushed for that and gotten those types of things through. So that's part of it. Another part of it is just kind of the difference in academia. And in the United States, obviously, academia is very left wing as it is in Australia, but there's still a little bit more diversity in terms of views that people have. And the reason why that's important is that you have people who are willing to stick up more and just say, look, guys, you're getting the data wrong on this thing, and go and make those types of arguments. So, I mean, Australians are convinced that the 96 and 97 confiscation that you had of guns made the country safer. But, there's just really basic statistical errors that they're making in that discussion that when I gave the talk at ANU, there were people there that understood immediately what the problems were, but nobody had spoken out about these things. So you have claim that after the confiscation, they had over a 50% drop in firearm homicides. and an over 70% drop in firearm suicides. The problem is, imagine, just for simplicity, you had a perfectly straight line that was falling over the entire period. You could pick any point along that line, and the after average is below the before average. Though people who do statistics know how incredibly misleading looking at simple before and after averages can be. But if I just had a simple case where the line was falling at exactly the same rate before the law and exactly the same rate after, I look at it and I say, well, it's true the after average is below the before average, but it's pretty hard for me to see that the law had any impact on the changes in crime over time. What you'd want to look at is, did it fall at a faster rate? Did it fall at a slower rate? Was there some discontinuity that occurred in the line? There's like none of that discussion in the Australian media that's occurring there. None of that, even though, I think from my academics I talked to, they knew the issues that were there, but even the few that knew it, that looked at it, I mean, most of them just read what was in the newspapers and didn't look at it more deeply. But if you look at firearm homicides in Australia and suicides, they were falling for 15 years prior to the confiscation. Firearm homicides actually stopped falling for 8 years afterwards. Firearm suicides continue to fall at about a much slower rate. I look at those things and I think, if anything, this kind of had the opposite effect of what gun control advocates would be predicting. But it's even much worse than that. Because anybody who does statistics would say, well, why are you only looking at firearm suicides or firearm homicides? I'll give you a simple example. There are many countries, a number of countries around the world that have banned either all guns or all handguns. You may see a drop in firearm suicides afterwards, but there's no change that you ever see in total suicides. People simply switch to other ways to go and commit suicide. There are lots of ways of committing suicide. And in Australia, if you look at total suicides actually went up by 20% right after the confiscation that was there. Total homicides actually went up afterwards. Not as much, but it went up a lot. And so you would think, and I have followed the news media in Australia for years. You would think somebody would point out, well, firearm homicides and firearm suicides went down by this measure that we were using. But what happened to the totals? But there's like no discussion about what happens to the totals. I mean, I'm not going to go and argue that banning, or the gun confiscation caused a 20% increase in suicides. But it sure as hell is inconsistent with the notion that it reduced it. And there are other things I could bring up. I'll just bring up one other point, and that is, look at how gun ownership changed over time as a result of the confiscation. There was an immediate 29% drop in gun ownership with the confiscation in 96 and 97. But people were allowed to go and buy guns again after that. And by at least 2010, the gun ownership rate in Australia was well above what it was before the confiscation. Well, if that's the case, and I don't know how much earlier, but I just know by 2010 it was above that. What should you have seen if the gun control advocates are right? You should have seen an immediate sharp drop in firearm homicides and firearm suicides, if that's what you wanted to look at, or total suicides and total homicides, and then an increase over time as the gun ownership rate went up. That's not what you see at all. It's not even remotely close to that. And yet nobody makes those arguments. And it's not discussed in the media at all. And I blame the academics that are there, because they're the ones who should know how to evaluate these things easily. I mean, this is not rocket science. In fact, you don't even need to have a Ph.D. to be able to point out these things. And
I mean, there's so much to unpack out of all of that. And I always say to people, don't get angry. It's just data. It's very hard to argue with the facts and the stats. And you're absolutely right. No one is doing that. And I'm interested by that. It's probably more of a sort of a psychometric thing as to how it's happened. But there is that pressure. In the United States, of course, you have lobby groups that do a lot of this work, like the NRA, of course, and others. But it's also bricked in with the Second Amendment. So, and I assume that's another reason why the control, the ability for your Congress and your Senate to pass those laws is, sort of bricked in there. We don't have that.
So the big Supreme Court decision we had was in 2008. And I have to tell you, I think, you have all the liberal justices on the Supreme Court will go and say that they don't believe that there's an individual right to self-defense, let alone individual right. And they'll say that now, despite the fact that there have been a number of court decisions on this. Democrats want to get rid of the filibuster in the Senate. And if they take control again, which, is surely possible, they basically have committed to stacking the Supreme Court, packing the Supreme Court with more, increasing it from 9 to 15 justices, for example. And if they do that, then, my guess is they'll reinterpret the Second Amendment the way they want to reinterpret it. And so it's really kind of, and the bottom line is, I think whether you're a judge or a justice, it comes down to they won't do something that they think is going to result in more deaths and more harm. And so if you haven't already kind of won kind of the intellectual debate about whether allowing individuals to go and defend themselves helps reduce crime or not, you're going to lose the court decisions too. And, the way, so anyway, it's, I think that's, I know a lot of people point to the Second Amendment type thing. And you mentioned the NRA. For years after my original work came out, my book, More Guns, Less Crime, was published in 1998, the first edition. I've had 3 editions from the University of Chicago Press. But when my work first came out, the NRA disliked me. They disagreed with me on a lot of things. And they would, for years, they would go and if a reporter would call up and say, well, who else should I talk to? And they'd say, do not talk to Lott. Okay. And part of the thing that's going on there, and I ran into this some when I was in Australia with your groups there down there, is I don't make Second Amendment arguments, but that's what their bread and butter was before. And the reason why they would do that before was because that's what the potential members cared about. And so they wanted to have a message that would go and attract the 5 million people who would go and join their group. The problem, as I saw it, was that, look, guys, you do whatever you want, but if you're going to win the political debate, you're going to have to, and I kind of viewed myself as being in the middle of this, and so that's the reason why I thought about it this way, is that the bottom line comes down to safety. If you convince people that banning guns makes them safer, then they're going to be willing to trade off freedom for safety, no matter what the Second Amendment says on something like that. And so, look, to me, the point is pretty simple, and that is you can make it risky. To reduce crime, you have to make it risky for criminals to commit crime. And you can do that with higher arrest rates, higher conviction rates, longer prison sentences. But you can also do it by allowing victims to be able to go and defend themselves. And it's particularly true for 2 groups of people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly, okay? And people who are the most likely victims of violent crime. In the United States, that overwhelmingly tends to be poor Blacks who live in high crime urban areas. Police are extremely important. But the question is, when a victim is having to confront a criminal by themselves, and they're almost always having to confront a criminal by themselves. The police themselves understand that they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crimes occurred. The question is how people should be responding. And when you're talking about a woman, for example, you're almost always talking about a young male criminal doing the attack. And when a man is attacking a woman, there's a larger strength difference that exists there than when a man is attacking another man. And we have something called the National Crime Victimization Survey in the United States, which surveys 240,000 people a year. And they have amazingly detailed data on crimes, what crimes were attempted or committed, how the victims responded, what the outcome was, the characteristics of the criminal. And what you find, there's a myth out there that, and it comes from the National Crime Victimization Survey data, but I'd argue a misreading of it, where you will frequently hear that people should behave passively when they're confronted by a criminal. And there's a kernel of truth to that. If you compare passive behavior to all forms of active resistance lumped together, passive behavior is slightly safer. The problem is you're lumping together things that are vastly different in terms of the safety of the victims. For example, for a woman, by far the most dangerous course of action for a woman to take if she's confronted by a criminal is to use her fists. And that's, if she uses her fist, she's going to get a physical response back from the attacker and a high probability of serious injury or death. The second most dangerous course of action for a woman to take is to run away. Now, obviously, if she can run away and escape, that's great. But women tend to be significantly slower runners on average than men are. And in the process of being tackled and subdued, they can end up being seriously injured. And there are all sorts of other things that they look at, like whether you have a baseball bat, I suppose it would be a cricket bat in your country, or a knife or whatever. But the problem with those other things is that if you're close enough to actually use those, the woman is at a real disadvantage at that point. The guy will catch the bat that's being swung at them. And if they're that close, the woman is going to lose the struggle. And what you find is that by far, the safest course of action for people to take, both men and women, but particularly for women, is to have a gun. Women who behave passively are 2.4 times more likely to end up being seriously injured than a woman who has a gun. But those differences are lost when everybody just lumps all the different types of active resistance together. So, to get back to the main point here, and that is there are lots of ways of reducing crime, but they all have a common feature of making it risky for criminals to go and commit crime. And just one other thing, you kind of ask what the difference is. In the one of the big things that affect people's perceptions about guns is media coverage. If you constantly hear about bad things that happen, but never hear about defensive gun uses, how can you blame anybody for believing, well, if I just get rid of the guns, I'm going to make people safer? In Australia, since you've basically made it illegal for people to use guns defensively to go and protect themselves, you've taken away that strong argument that are there. So you don't have stories like that where people would go and use guns defensively. In the United States, people may not realize this, but guns are used defensively to stop crimes about 5 times more frequently each year than they're used in the commissions of crime. Now, most of those aren't, quote, newsworthy. And one of the reasons for that is that 95% of the time that people use guns defensively, simply brandishing a gun is sufficient to cause a criminal to go and break off an attack. So let's say you're an editor of a news bureau and you have 2 stories that come across your desk. In one case, there's a dead body on the ground. In another case, let's say a woman's brandished a gun, the criminals run away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground. You're not even sure what crime would have been committed in that case because it didn't occur because the criminal ran away. If you're editor of a news bureau, which story are you going to run with? I think anybody's going to run with the first story. Now, we may care about both cases from a policy perspective in terms of what makes people safer. But from a newsworthiness perspective, it's understandable why you just go with the dead body on the ground that's there. But it's more than that. I mean, while that explains a lot of it, it doesn't explain everything. I can give you, on our website at crimeresearch.org, since 2020, we've collected 50 cases, virtually all of them local media stories, where police have said that if it hadn't been for the presence of a concealed carry permit holder, there would have been a mass public shooting and many people would have been killed. Those don't get national news coverage, let alone international news coverage. And so in Australia, you have crimes, though I have to say the media does a pretty poor job just discussing crimes in Australia is kind of the first thing that we mentioned there. I don't understand. The Australian Bureau of Statistics puts out two sets of numbers. It puts out reported crimes to the police, but it also puts out total crimes. And for some reason, the media in Australia completely, as far as I can tell, I haven't found any news stories that goes and talks about what's the total crimes rate there. They focus on only crimes reported to police. And, as I mentioned before, if you only have 19% or 9% of rapes and sexual assaults being reported to police, I would hope somebody would say, well, maybe we ought to figure out why Australia has such an incredibly low rate of people reporting crimes to the police. I talked to one prosecutor in New South Wales, and she mentioned that less than half of reported rapes and sexual assaults were prosecuted there. And it didn't sound like they had a great rate of winning even the cases that they brought. I don't know what it was. I mean, that's another thing. You guys should have data on things like, what rate are cases prosecuted? What's the success rate on those cases? I can't find that easily in your country. And I gave a talk to some university students in New South Wales from different universities that were there. And there were a number of women there at the talk. And I was mentioning the rape and sexual assault rates were 3 times higher in Australia and the low rate of reporting. And the women were not surprised. These were young college-age women, but they were basically saying, look, it's embarrassing to come forward and report a rape or a sexual assault. And if nothing's going to happen to the guy who did that, why do you want to come forward and do that? So I would hope some politicians would bring in some of the, others that are there, or talk to people in the media or do other things, write op-ed pieces or do other things that will get this discussion there saying, look, we have a real problem. Even if you believe the ABS numbers, only 19% of rapes and sexual assaults are being reported to police. This is unacceptable. We have to figure out why it's so low, what we have to do to fix this. And as I say, I think if you look at it the way I think it should be looked at, it's even lower than that. And sorry for going on about that.
Yeah, I think the power is in the data. I was thinking as you were speaking, because the position in Australia, if you went out and asked any politician or any law enforcement person or whoever it might be, the general view would be, we have a police force, the police are trained, they have firearms, and it's up to them. If you're being broken into, you ring the police and they turn up, and then, that's how that's how you defend yourself in Australia. And I was interested there, you talked a little bit about that, but what does the data say about that? I mean, in a country like Australia, it must be the case almost always when someone breaks and enters or whatever it might be, that the police are turning up after it's done and dusted. I mean, that must be...
Oh, yeah. Oh, you don't have data on that for Australia. I wish you did. There's lots of holes that you have in your data compared to other countries. But the burglary rate in Australia is, according to the ABS, comparing it to our Bureau of Justice Statistics data, is 2.5 times higher than the burglary rate in the United States. Your assault rate is twice as high as the assault rate in the United States. So now, one thing I wish you guys had data for, and that is something called hot burglaries or residential robberies. These occur while the residents are at home. And the UK does have this data, and I can compare it to the United States. The UK burglary rate's not quite as high as Australia. It's about twice as high as the burglary rate in the United States. But The hot burglary rate in the UK is 59%. So you have twice the rate of burglaries, and almost 60% of the time, the people are at home when the robbery occurs. In the United States, it's 13%. Another thing I'll just point out the typical burglary that occurs in the United States occurs at like 2 in the afternoon. The typical burglary in the UK occurs at like 9 or 10 o'clock in the evening. And one other fact I'll just mention, because they go and do surveys of burglars in different countries who have been incarcerated. American burglars spend twice as long casing a home before they break in compared to their British counterparts. How do all these things fit together? Well, the reason why American burglars burglar at 2 in the afternoon is people are less likely to be home. They're less likely to be out. But even though they're doing it at a time when people aren't home, they still spend twice as long casing a home before they break in. Why did they do this? Well, they're worried about getting shot. And one way of protecting yourself from not getting shot is to make sure nobody's home when you go and break in. Now, why did the British burglars, why did they break in the evening? Why did they break in 59% of the time when people are at home? Well, the reason why they do that is then they can force people to tell them where their valuables are hidden. American burglars presumably want to be able to force people to go and tell them where their valuables are hidden, but they're willing to give that up in order to stay alive, okay, and not get hurt by some type of shooting that's there. I mean, it's just a simple example of how deterrence works in terms of changing. So, it's riskier. You're not going to get as much money when you go and burglarize in the United States, so there's less burglary that occurs. It's not rocket science for figuring that out. But now there's one other problem I need to tell you about in comparing Australia to the United States, and that is the National Crime Victimization data counts each separate rape or sexual assault or burglary or assault separately. In Australia, the ABS numbers that you have just say, has that person been victimized by that type of crime over the year? So somebody may have been sexually assaulted twice, or they may have been burglarized twice if they live in, that still only counts as one case in your data. So even though that the way that's counted, you have these incredibly high rates of violent crime compared to the United States. And this is something that's been going on for a long time. There used to be something called the International Crime Victimization Survey. And the nice thing about that was that they asked the exact same questions, counted the data the exact same way across countries, and defined all the crimes exactly the same way. And in 2000, the violent crime rate in Australia was about 75% higher than the violent crime rate in the United States. Now, there's one other thing I have to tell you, and that is when I gave my talk at ANU, I was talking to a researcher there who came to my seminar. I talked to her afterwards, who had been trying to get the old survey data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, okay? They claimed they never kept the data. And the reason why the ABS claimed that they never kept the data was that it would cost too much money. They didn't have the money to go and store the data, which is just absolutely, unbelievably nutso, okay? So the ABS surveys like 26,000 people a year. So just imagine an Excel file that has 26,000 rows in it and maybe, 50 columns there. You're talking about a couple of megabytes of data, okay? Somebody could go and spend $100 and buy 2 terabyte hard disk for the ABS, and they could store the data for the next 100 years that they have on that. And so, I mean, she was laughing when she told me this story because she just said, it's just not serious. Nobody believes that they don't have room on the servers for the ABS to go and, save, a few megabytes of data. there, but you got some weird things going on there with the country and the data that's there. So I don't know why anybody would write the questions the way they do, just to say how many times have you been victimized, and not count the number of times that you have been victimized, just whether you have been, and why they don't keep the data that's there. But somebody needs to bring in people from the ABS and ask them some hard questions.
Yeah, a very, very fair point. And I mean, look, there are anomalies everywhere on this. We've had that
And
through
I'm just
COVID.
going on what this academic told me. But go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
yeah. Well, that's
Yeah, go ahead.
right. We have seen different ways of reporting statistics. During COVID as well, we used to be able to get a very clear picture of excess deaths over the 5-year baseline, which subsequently has been turned into a different reporting figure, which it makes it much, much harder to find that. So, I don't know the answer to that, but certainly I hear it again and again. One of the other things you talked about in one of your articles that I read was this concept, and it probably plays into a little bit about what you said about the break-in statistics, but there are places in blue cities, in Democrat cities, run cities in the United States, and that have gun-free zones. And I thought that was a really interesting point, and about what that shows in terms of, the crime rates inside those gun-free zones compared to outside, which I think also lends to your point a little bit. But can you tell me a little bit about those?
Right. Well, I mean, just another example of deterrence. Look, because of the work I do, I force myself to read the diaries and manifestos for these mass murders that occur, not just in the United States, but around the world. And these people may be crazy in some sense, but they're not stupid. Their goal overwhelmingly is to commit suicide, but they want to do so in a way that's going to get them attention. And they know the more people they kill, the more media attention that they're going to be able to go and get. And they know if they go to a place where guns are banned, okay, they're going to be able to go and kill more people and get more media attention. And and um, and it just drives me nuts. It's probably my biggest pet peeve with media bias. But even though these murders continually, time after time, in their diaries and manifestos, explain why they picked the target that they did, the media will never, in the news stories, cover that part of the diary and manifesto. I want somebody to give me a benign explanation for why the media never considers it newsworthy to go and report on why these guys pick the targets that they do. The media will go and say, well, the guy talked about other mass murderers. And that's true. He did. But the reason why they talked about him was because of what they learned from them in terms of what targets to pick. So we had this school shooter in Minneapolis last fall. He murdered 2 people and wounded 17 others at this Catholic school. And he explained that he had been studying other mass murders. And these guys, 6 months is a short amount of time for them to plan these attacks. A year, 2 years, more than 2.5 years is not uncommon. Uh, and he talked about other mass shooters, and what he had learned from them was to pick a gun-free zone. And that's the reason why he said he picked the school. Not all schools in the United States are gun-free zones. There's certain ones that are and ones that aren't. But the thing is, he didn't just pick the school. He picked the time of day. He didn't want to do it in the morning when parents were dropping off their kids at school. He didn't want to do it in the afternoon when they were dropping them off, because he was worried that one of the parents there might have a permanent concealed handgun and might use it to go and stop him. So we recently, and the thing is, people don't appreciate what an incredibly difficult job law enforcement has in stopping these active shooting or mass shooting cases. And the reason is that if somebody's in uniform, you give real tactical advantages to the attackers. So let's say you want to go and shoot up a place and you see an officer there who's in uniform. What can you do? Well, you can either wait for the officer to leave before you attack, or you can move on to another target. Both of those make it less likely that an officer will be present when the attack occurs. But if you insist on attacking there, who do you shoot first? You shoot the officer first, right? And the thing is, so we've looked at all the active shooting attacks in the United States. The FBI defines it as a gun fired in public, not part of some other type of crime like a gang fight over drug turf or a robbery. Anything from one person being shot at and missed all the way up to a mass public shooting. Civilians with permanent concealed handguns stopped much more of these attacks than police did for the first two reasons that I was bringing up. But even though the police stopped fewer of these attacks, they were 12 times more likely to get killed in active shooting attacks than civilians. Because, in the United States, we have air marshals that fly on some planes. Does anybody think that an air marshal ought to be in uniform? Nobody that I talk to ever thinks that air marshals ought to be in uniform. And why not? Well, because if you do have terrorists on a plane, and you have the one guy that could possibly stop them is in uniform, who do you think the terrorists are going to try to take out first? And so I have to tell you, so I went to Bondi Beach when I was there. I had the rabbi who had the synagogue right there. He actually had some of his children were at the attack when it occurred. And when the attack occurred, there was like no police that were there. When we went there that day, on December 14th, there was no police there. When we went there, when I was in town, there were like 14 police in uniform around there, and to me, that just means there are other targets that aren't being covered if you have that many there. And to have them all in uniform doesn't make a lot of sense. So they have a guard in front of the synagogue there near the beach. And apparently, for the guard to carry a gun, he must be in uniform to be able to go and carry a gun. That's what the guard was telling me. He's applied for it, had to jump through all sorts of hoops. And I was trying to explain to both the guard and the rabbi, that's not what you want to do, okay? What you want to do, and also he's supposed to stand out in front of the synagogue. So if somebody's going to go and attack the synagogue, they take him out, right? And then they have free reign to go after other people that are there. What I was telling him, what you want to do, and I've advised synagogues in the United States and in Europe and other places where it's possible to do something, and that is put a sign in front of your house of worship or wherever it is that says, warning, select people in here are carrying concealed and will use their guns to go and protect others that are there. And so, that way they don't know who it is they have to worry about when they go and break in. They break into the synagogue there, and maybe somebody behind them or to the side is the guy with the gun who's going to shoot them then. And it makes it a lot riskier for them to go and do it. So I don't know who put these regulations together that you have there, that the guy who's carrying has to be in uniform, okay? Or that you have all these police. You have like 65,000 police in Australia, okay? You don't have data on this, but my guess is at most you have, absolute most, you have 22,000 or so on duty at any point in time. That's 22,000 people to cover a population of like 27.5 million people that's there.
How does that relate to the United States? How does that overlay on the United States figure?
Well, it's similar. It's very similar. But the point is, in the United States, the police understand they can't be there all the time. So you have one officer on duty to protect every 1,245 people in Australia. That's asking him to do a lot. He simply can't be there all the time to go and protect everybody who's there. And that's one reason to allow victims to be able to go and defend themselves. But the other thing is, these guys are in uniform all the time, and that reduces their effectiveness for stopping certain types of crimes. So I travel around the world and give talks to police and other things. In the last year, I've been to Ecuador, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Peru to go and give talks. And some of these South American countries, it cracks me up. So the police cars, they have the lights going on all the time on top of the car. And you talk to the police and you say, how many people do you catch for speeding? It's like zero. and, and, is it that a surprise? I mean, are you going to be able to sneak up on somebody if you have your lights blazing, up ahead or something like that? And so, um, I think there are things that you can do in Australia. I'd put up a sign at places that you think might be targets, kind of like we are just talking about with the synagogue there, that just warn them. I assume they're not going to have 14 police there all the time. And I assume they're not going to have 14 police there at all the other beaches that you have around there, okay, or all the other possible targets. You simply don't have enough police to do that. And so what I would do is, if you're not going to let civilians protect themselves, I would at least put up a sign that says warning. Even if it's not true, I'd put up a sign that says warning. Select police officers here are carrying undercover, concealed, so that at least you put doubt in the mind of the possible attackers, kind of like the air marshal that we were talking about.
The argument in Australia would be that if everyone is disarmed, then you don't have people who and those people apparently had licenses for their firearms, and many others have as well in the United States. So if you remove all of the guns, everyone's safe. What do the stats say about that?
Yeah, that's exactly the right question to ask. And there have been a number of places in the world that have banned either all guns or all handguns. We've tried it with handguns in Washington, D.C. and Chicago in the United States, but there are countries around the world. Now, people will go and say the experiments in Chicago and Washington, D.C. weren't fair, because unless you ban guns over the whole country, people can get guns from the rest of Illinois or from Indiana or from Maryland or Virginia. The problem is that doesn't explain why murder rates and violent crime rates went up. It may explain why it didn't go down. Okay, people were able to have guns to begin with on those places. But even if you look at island nations, whether it be the Solomon Islands or whether it be Jamaica or the Republic of Ireland or the UK, every single time when either all guns or all handguns have been banned, murder rates, homicide rates go up right away, and often by multiple fold, 3-fold, 4, 7-fold increases are not uncommon there. And the question is, why is that? We're banning guns. We're hopefully trying to take guns away from everybody that you're talking about there. What happens? Well, the problem is that when you put these, and this applies to more than just gun bans, this applies to gun control regulations generally, you have to be careful who obeys the law. If it's primarily the most law-abiding good citizens who obey the laws and turn in their guns, and you may take a few guns away from the criminals, but if you're primarily taking guns away from the law-abiding good citizens, you actually make it easier for the criminals to go and commit crime. Now, in the United States, and I know in a lot of South American countries, which I've studied more in depth, in parts of Europe, the major source of illegal guns are drug gangs. Okay? The thing is, it's not like a drug gang can go to the police and say, look, this other gang stole our drugs. Can you help us get them back? They have to go and set up their own little militaries in order to go and protect that extremely valuable property that they have there. If I could go and click my fingers and cause all illegal drugs in the United States to disappear and all guns, how long would it take for illegal drugs to start coming back into the United States? If I live in El Paso, Texas, 20 minutes? And how long would it be before they would go and bring in the weapons that they need to be able to go and protect that extremely valuable property? They'd be bringing them in at the same time. Mexico, which has a huge drug gang problem there, since 1972, there's only been one gun store in Mexico. It's run by the military. Weapons are extremely expensive. The most powerful gun that you can buy is a .22 caliber short round bolt action rifle. That's not the gun that the drug gangs are using down there. It just to apply for a permit. And I've talked to Mexican senators when they've had me down there to testify before the Mexican Senate and House. I've talked to Mexican senators who have been denied being able to go and get a permit for a gun, even though they get lots of death threats and stuff like that. You have it costs $2,300 just to apply with no guarantee that you'll be approved to go and get a permit. And less than 1/10 of the adult Mexican population is legally licensed to own a gun. And yet the murder rate in Mexico has more than doubled since they instituted these laws in 72. And in many recent years, their murder rate has been 6 times higher than the murder rate in the United States. And yet they have this ban that's there. It hasn't stopped. You know, I don't know if you followed this, but they just killed the head of one of the Mexican drug cartels. If you read the news stories, this guy had rocket launchers. He had air-to-air, he had surface-to-air missiles to take out planes and other things that are there. Okay? These guys, just as they bring in the drugs from around the rest of the world, they bring in guns and other weapons from the rest of the world that's there. And so the bottom line is, when you go and you have these bans, and this applies to gun control laws generally, you have to be careful. Who are you primarily going to be disarming? If you're primarily going to be disarming law-abiding good citizens relative to criminals, you make it easier for criminals. And the other thing, just to point out, and I think I mentioned this earlier, but I'll just repeat it, and that is people in the United States use guns defensively 5 times more frequently each year to stop crimes than guns are used in the commission of crimes. When I was chief economist for the U.S. Sentencing Commission in Washington, that's the federal agency that's used to set the penalty guidelines for judges to follow for all federal crimes in the United States. I must have read over 1,000 trial transcripts. And what you find over and over again is you get one criminal to kind of make a plea bargain where he'll agree to go and testify against another criminal. And when that happens, the prosecutors just invariably ask the same questions, no matter who the prosecutor is. How did you find this victim, for example? And the robber will say, well, we were thinking about going after the drug dealer down the street because he has lots of money, but he has lots of guns. And we thought, it's probably wise not to go after him. And then we were thinking about going and robbing a cab driver. But, a lot of the cab drivers carry guns. So that would be kind of silly to go after them. And then we saw this small woman walking alone at night across a dark parking lot. And she looked like a really easy target that's there. And so we, knocked her down and stole from her. And so, the bottom line is that these criminals, whether it's the burglary stuff that we were talking about earlier, or I could give, the mass public shootings or whatever, these guys may be not the brightest people around, but they're not so stupid that they don't realize that if they can go and accomplish the same crime at a lower risk to themselves, they'll do that.
And so I think there's there's so many different angles there, but I'm thinking back to one last point I'd just be interested in making. We might wrap it up, but I because there's just there is so much to cover. The other flip side to this is the example of Switzerland, which I recall reading a while ago, has, I think, the second highest per capita gun ownership, or might even be more, than the United States. They have almost no problems with firearms, as I can understand it. But they are a good example, I think, of a society that's managed that well. Would that be fair in saying? Does the data support that?
Right. Okay. So the data on gun ownership that you cited is from something called the Small Arms Survey, and they just get the numbers completely wrong on all sorts of things. So the thing is, up until recently, if you were a young male between 18 and 34, you would be required to have a machine gun, and in many cases a handgun, that they would give you as part of the militia. Now, you didn't technically own the gun, but it was at your house, okay? And once you turned 34, you could apply to remain in the militia, and the vast majority of able-bodied men would continue to do that. And they would continue renewing up until age 65. And at that point, the government would give you permission to buy the weapons that you had. Okay? So the thing is, do you go and look at, quote, ownership, okay, technical legal ownership, or do you look at possession? Because if you look at actual possession, the gun possession rate in Switzerland is like much, much higher than the gun possession rate in the United States. And Switzerland has traditionally had the lowest murder rate in Europe. Okay. Now, I don't like making purely cross-sectional comparisons because there's so many other things that could vary in culture or other things that are there. What I like to do is to follow places over time and look at lots of different places, because what people will go and they'll say, look, the UK has a low homicide rate compared to the United States, and they have very strict gun control. So it must be that they have very, low homicide rate because they have strict gun control. The thing is, before they had gun control, they had an even lower homicide and murder rate. There's an excellent book. So the first gun control law in the UK was 1920, and it had nothing to do with crime. You had just had the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. You had all these unemployed soldiers returning home from World War I. And the government there was worried that they would have their own Bolshevik Revolution in the UK. And so what they did was they essentially passed a tax for you to register your guns there to make it so that middle income and lower income individuals in the UK couldn't afford to own a gun. But there's an excellent book by a historian from Harvard University Press called Guns and Violence. Her name is Joyce Lee Malcolm. And I can't even get my mind around these numbers. The greater London area in 1900 had over 8 million people there. Do you know how many this is before they had any gun control laws, guns very commonly owned. In fact, if you want to do something fun, go and get old copies of the London Sunday Times. You will see advertisements for all sorts of guns in there. They had briefcase guns, had walking stick guns, had regular guns, had book guns, had guns all over the place. And yet, do you know how many firearm murders they had in 1900 in an area of over 8 million people? Two. I can't even get my mind around that. They had 5 armed robberies. Now, maybe they had taken all the criminals and taken them to Australia. I don't know. Okay. but the point is, they had gun ownership was very common. Okay. And no crime. And so, and in fact, if you look, they had 3 major gun control laws, 1920, 1956, and January 1997. And the homicide rate went up after those gun control laws. It was still lower than the United States, but it went up afterwards. In the 8 years after the 1997 handgun ban that they had there, the homicide rate in the UK increased by 50%. It fell afterwards, but the reason why it fell was because people were so upset about the rising crime rates there, and it was more than just homicides, that they demanded more police. And over a 2-year period of time there, right at the peak, you had a 14% increase in the number of police. And over a 4-year period of time, you had an 18% increase in the number of police. And even though they had this massive increase in the number of police, after about 17, 18 years, they could only bring the homicide rate back to about what it was before the 97 gun ban went into effect.
I mean, the stats are actually fascinating, and it's a fascinating discussion. It's just not one that is being prosecuted at all in this country, I have to say. And it's a shame that there isn't more debate, that there isn't more exposure to that, because the feeling in Australia is that we are an increasingly dangerous place. I mean, there's been a lot of I think with worse economic times, the crime rate obviously goes up. So, I mean, it really is something that needs more discussion, I think. And as I said, the data doesn't lie. It's a shame that you didn't get more of an opportunity to get this out in the media. I don't think the media would be very happy with that take on it, because that's what they do. But I thank you for taking the time to do that, because I think it is important for people to hear, and some of these myths to be dispelled. It's fascinating data. It's a fascinating topic. And thanks for taking the time to come out to Australia, and thanks for taking the time to come in today. We might have a chat later on at some point when when things progress a bit in Australia as well. I think people would be very interested to hear this getting out there.
Well, I'm always happy to talk to you. People can find more at our website, as well as the underlying data for the things at crimeresearch.org, crimeresearch.org. But 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 somehow it has to be brought into people's consciousness what a high violent crime rate you have in Australia, because then and also things like 19%, even if you take the ABS numbers there for, crimes report, rapes and sexual assaults reported to police, that should be, people should say, this is outrage. We need to do something about it. And so, I assume the Labor Party there wants to go and claim that they care about women and stuff like that. How can you say you care about them if you're not willing to go and address this problem and try to fix it, so that you go and actually give people an incentive? If they don't think anything's going to happen to the criminals, and that's the reason why they're not reporting them, well, you better fix that. There are ways you can go and do to fix that. And so, and my guess is, if you can go and educate people on what the crime numbers are, because as we started off, I was amazed. Everybody thinks Australia is such a low crime country that's there. Your homicide rate's about half the homicide rate in the United States, but all these other violent crime things. So, about 1% of violent crimes involve murder in the United States. Obviously, it's even lower in your country. But you still have this other 99+% of violent crimes that are occurring, which are very high there. And your ABS needs to do a better job of how it collects the data. It needs to keep the data that it collects. And people need to go and have discussions about what it needs to be done in order to make people in Australia safer. And maybe if you do that, obviously you can go and deal with the policing issues and the prosecution issues, but you don't even have data on the rate of successful prosecutions in the country. That you can deal with the low-hanging fruit, but then you can begin to say, well, maybe we should let women have pepper spray or have something else that would be there, and get at least the mindset to think, well, maybe there are things people can do to protect themselves. And maybe eventually you'll get to some place where you'll give them even more useful means, such as having a gun. But it's going to be a long process that's there, but you have to get people to understand police aren't going to be there all the time. People aren't reporting a lot of crimes to the police. And what can we do to fix that? Because you got to realize that there's a problem first. If you ever want to write an op-ed or something like that, I'm more than happy to do that with you, if that could help get out some of this information.
Well, John, thanks again. Fascinating stuff and really important. And so thanks for coming to Australia, and thanks for having a chat to me on the Based podcast.
Well, thank you very much.